Okay, welcome back to chapter 12 of the Rathus text. We're going to wrap up this chapter by continuing our discussion of psychological disorders. In the previous video, we defined what psychological disorders are, looking at the three Ds, and then we jumped into some specific classifications of disorders, including anxiety, I think somatoform, and dissociative were the last thing we covered. The next thing we're going to look at are mood disorders. And again, we're talking about mood disorders. This is much different from just feeling sad or feeling the blues or feeling happy and feeling elated. We're talking about very severe or prolonged disturbances in moods that go beyond just the normal spectrum of mood. It's okay to feel like happy and sad and angry and feel emotions, like that's part of being human. But when we talk about mood disorders, these are the ones where we're chronically feeling maybe sad, or the blues, for example, or chronically feeling elated to the point where it could be dysfunctional for our own well-being. These disorders obviously will impair our ability to function. They're distressful, and they're deviant from normal moods. So one of the more common, or one of the most sort of interesting mood disorders that's discussed is bipolar disorder, which is a combination of extreme mood swings going from elation or mania, which is sort of the high end of the spectrum, to depression, which is more like lethargy, just feeling unmotivated, feeling lethargic, not necessarily feeling sad, but just maybe not feeling anything at all. And again, so fluctuating between these two poles. That's why it's called bipolar. You have two poles, two polar extremes, mania and depression. And so you'll see cycles where somebody who's experiencing bipolar, they'll be, manic for a while, and they'll have these, sort of these crashes, these come downs where they experience depression. And you'll oftentimes hear people will complain about the disorder whenever they're depressed, but maybe not so when they're manic, because when they're manic, they feel on top of the world. But when they're depressed, they feel the exact opposite. So it really depends on when you catch somebody in bipolar, how they maybe think about their own disorder. But typically mania, even though those high highs feel great, oftentimes they lead to are associated with poor judgments, poor behavior, really just ideas are kind of flying all over the place, some that make sense, some that do not. And in some cases, mania can even be misdiagnosed, or can be so extreme that it's a borderline psychotic, or in fact psychotic. Okay, so truth or fiction, feeling elated is not always a good thing. What do you think, true or false? It is in fact true. Yeah, feeling happy is good, feeling elated is good, but sometimes maybe there's such a thing as too much of a good thing, feeling too good, feeling too elated. That's when we start getting into mania. The other side of the coin, is major depressive disorder, another mood disorder, a very commonly diagnosed mood disorder. This is, sometimes it used to be called unipolar depression, meaning you only stayed in depression, versus bipolar depression, where you fluctuated between mania and bipolar, or mania and depression. But anyways, major depressive disorder is what we commonly think of as having depression. Some of the symptoms include changes in appetite, serious weight loss, agitation, and sometimes even slowing down of psychomotor functions, where you just aren't operating on the same frequency. Maybe you just don't move the same. You're just much slower. You're much more lethargic in your thought and movement. So lots of behavioral changes. So you can actually see the manifestations of some of these behaviors. In some cases, you might even see some symptoms include psychotic behavior, delusions, or such a feeling unloved or feeling unworthy, feelings of guilt, and lots of things that might borderline on psychotic behavior. So the symptoms of depression can vary in extremes. But it's again one of those things that ideally you can kind of pick up on physically, and seeing the behaviors of other people. Maybe their weight's changing, their sleep, their appetite, how easily agitated they are, how slow they are in their movement, things like that, are things that you can see. And there are several different views on where this comes from a learning theorist. People are in their lives, maybe in their jobs, their relationships, somewhere they're just not getting the reinforcement they need from some source. Maybe it's parents, maybe it's boyfriend, girlfriend, somebody. We're just not getting that feedback that we need, and we have an external locus of control. Basically, we think we see control outside of ourselves. And there's a lot of, this link between depression and learned helplessness. If we just fail over and over and over again, we kind of learn that, oh, this is what I should expect. Why even bother? Why try? I just keep failing. And so this sort of manifests the beginnings of depressive thoughts. Cognitive factors that also are linked to depression. I mean, people who have really high expectations, for themselves, maybe to the point of perfection, like everything has to be perfect. I have to do it right all the time. I mean, if you set that bar that high, then you're kind of always be letting yourself down. Some people who have attributional styles, basically, if they attribute success to something that is outside of themselves, like luck, and they attribute failure to something internal to themselves, such as like who they are as a person, then those are the sort of the cognitive biases that we see are associated with depression. Some other perspectives, a biological perspective, getting back to neurotransmitters like serotonin. We might also see connections to neuroticism as well. If you look at some of those big 5 personality traits, neuroticism is at play, linked to anxiety and depression. So those are a couple of other perspectives. The biopsychosocial view is probably the true answer. It's a lot of things. People have a biological predisposition to depression. Some people have, cognitively speaking, between their ears, self-efficacy expectations and their attitudes will have an impact. And then also people who are surrounded by more stressors. We talked about this in a previous chapter, but stress is conducive for depression. It's conducive for anxiety. So people who find themselves more stressed and experiencing more losses, for example, in life, may be more prone to depression. There is also a much stronger likelihood of being diagnosed with depression for females rather than males. I imagine a lot of that has to do with cultural and social ramifications. There's some links to estrogen perhaps, but also I just think that as a society, we place more stress on women than we do men. And I'm sure there's a male out there listening to this who probably firmly disagrees, who can think of their own experience or something. And I'm sure we can argue about that all day, but I just, from my perspective, and then what psychology suggests, that it's harder, especially if you add onto the top of that, if you're a minority female, I mean, you're compounding the stress even more so. So I think that it's not really surprising that women are more likely to be diagnosed than men. And also it may have to do with women maybe more likely to come forward and even admit there's a problem than males are. That's another cultural issue we're talking about here. But I think when we talk about females being twice as likely to be diagnosed, I don't think that means that women are twice as sad or twice as depressed necessarily. I think there's certain factors that are at play here. Okay, quick comprehension check. To be diagnosed with bipolar disorder, an individual must experience A, a manic episode, B, a depressive episode, C, a manic episode and a depressive episode, or D, a suicidal episode. Pause the video. What do you think? Okay, welcome back. It is C, a manic episode and a depressive episode. You got to have both. Unfortunately, one of the consequences we see of bipolar and mood disorders in general, one of the symptoms is suicidal ideation. And of course, people who think about suicide are far more likely to attempt suicide than somebody who doesn't, and that makes obvious sense. But it is for college students, especially if you're listening to this when you're a college student, this is very relevant to you because suicide is the third leading cause of death among 15 to 24-year-olds. So a major health problem for people younger generation, teenagers and early adults. The picture on the right here is Robin Williams, a man who passed away several years ago from suicide. Largely considered to be one of the greatest comedians of all time, comedic movie actors of all time, and yet, he committed suicide. He was suffering from bipolar disorder, and eventually took his own life from that. So when we talk about depression, we talk about bipolar disorder. I mean, these are very serious health consequences, health concerns with very large health consequences, including death in the form of suicide. So not something to really be taken lightly or joke about. Some things that might predict suicidal, ideation risk factors. Obviously feeling depressed is a huge red flag. Suicidal ideation and depression go hand in hand. Adolescence, if you have psychological problems during adolescence, that is a higher predictor of a suicidal ideation and attempts. More stressful life events. If you have this in your family already, like psychological disorders and suicide, I mean, you're kind of at a higher likelihood if that's in your family already. So. Other factors at play, more common among college students than students who don't attend college, which is interesting. Something about maybe the stress of going to college, even though you're learning and doing better for yourself, it still can be a pretty stressful experience. Some people, hit the wall. Some people are living on their own for the first time and dealing with stressors they've never had to deal with, and it's tough to react to that. We also see a pretty large trend about older adults committing suicide or committing suicide. It's surprisingly, when people start getting sick or people start losing loved ones, you start to think, okay, well, maybe I don't want to hang on anymore. So, we have a very older and aging population in the United States. So this is another one of those health concerns we have to be really careful and be mindful of, because it's a sort of growing social issue. Some different factors in terms of like race and ethnicity. You see different rates of suicide depending on race and ethnicity. For example, 1 in 6 Native Americans has attempted suicide, 1 in 8 Latin Americans. You also see, almost 1 in 10, a little less than 1 in 10 for European Americans. However, we see the lowest for African Americans, and I think a lot of this has to do with cultural implications. A lot of it has to do with poverty as well. But they're, for example, 1 in 6 Native Americans, it's really not surprising they have the highest rate because it's the racial and ethnic group in the United States that probably deals with the most poverty, has lacks a lot of the resources we need. They're spread out compared to other racial and ethnic groups. So you're also talking about differences in language too. So there's a number of factors involved, but I think it's really interesting we see such wide variations on this phenomenon. Gender differences, we also see differences in terms of female versus male. Females are 3 times as likely to attempt suicide, but males are 5 times more likely to actually succeed. And the rates are also the ways in which males and females attempt suicide is very different. Females are more likely to use methods like sleeping pills, for example, where males are more likely to use more violent methods like hanging themselves or shooting themselves or something like that. Some other myths that need to be taken into consideration. People who are, for example, these are common misconceptions or myths about suicide. People who threaten suicide are only seeking attention. That's not true. They may, in fact, be literally, hey, crying for help. Hey, I don't know how to talk about this any other way. I'm thinking about killing myself. I'm not, so it's not necessarily seeking attention. It's seeking help. Discussion of suicide prompts suicide attempts, meaning you can actually talk about this with people. If somebody kind of expresses something that makes you think, hey, they're talking about killing themselves, you can address that just by saying the word suicide or talking about it isn't going to make them run out and do it. They're already thinking about it, so you need to address that problem. People who take their own lives are insane. Not true. In fact, honestly, people right before they commit suicide or attempt suicide are at some of the most, they experience moments of clarity where they finally are at kind of ease with how things are. So things that, it's okay to talk about, and people who are taking their own lives oftentimes think it's the only choice they have, unfortunately. Okay, truth or fiction, people who seek or threaten suicide are only seeking attention. What do you think? Truth or fiction? Pause the video. That's fiction. It couldn't be further from the truth. They're crying out for help. They're reaching out the only way they know how. It's a really awkward, uncomfortable thing to talk about. And so maybe, it may seem like they're seeking attention, but maybe that's really the only way they know how to ask for help. Okay, another disorder we're going to talk about is schizophrenia. At this point, when we talk about schizophrenia, we are talking about probably the most severe psychological disorder. We're talking about a disorder that is associated with psychosis, which is a break from reality, a disturbance from reality. And so people with schizophrenia oftentimes will have disturbances in how they think. Their thoughts are very scattered and kind of all over the place, which is also expressed in their language. They may speak in ways that don't make any sense to anybody else but them. Their mood and their perceptions are distorted, and their attention is off. All kinds of things. Motor activity might be either sporadic, or they may in fact disengage in motor activity and sort of be stuck. So there's a lot of different things going on. Cases of schizophrenia are going to look different case by case, but this is probably the most severe disorder we're talking about. Okay. Some of the symptoms we have positive and negative symptoms of schizophrenia. This does not mean good and bad. This just simply means some symptoms are positive symptoms indicate presence of inappropriate behaviors, where negative symptoms mean the absence of appropriate behaviors. So, for example, a positive symptom of schizophrenia is hallucinations and delusion, or are hallucinations and delusions. These are things that are not present in normal behaviors. Hallucinations are seeing things or hearing things that aren't there. And delusions might be beliefs, like beliefs, delusions of grandeur, like I am the most important person in the world, I am the president of the United States. Those are positive symptoms, whereas negative symptoms are like flat affect, where they speak and talk in a way that doesn't express any kind of emotion. Also, they may go into, put their bodies into positions where they're totally rigid and motionless for hours on end, and it's almost like they're kind of stuck, and that would be sort of a negative symptom. It is primarily thought of to be a disorder of thought, because that seems to be what is disturbed the most, is our ability to think, and conversely our ability to communicate those thoughts to other people. So oftentimes you'll see people with schizophrenia dealing with delusions of grandeur, persecution, reference. Basically, they think they are bigger than they really are. They think people are out to get them. They may use their self as a point of reference in situations that have no meaning upon them. They're watching television and watching a basketball game, and all of a sudden they're thinking about the people at the basketball game, or watching them and not the other way around, or something like that is what we mean by delusions and perhaps hallucinations. So hallucinations, again, typically the most common are auditory, hearing voices or hearing things that aren't there. You also might see people who are engaged, their motor activity is very different when they are experiencing schizophrenic symptoms. For example, they may be very wild and all over the place, very demonstrative, or in fact, they may be completely slowed down in a state of catatonia, where they're almost frozen in this sort of statue-like position. Their affect tends to be flat or sometimes inappropriate, meaning they may either speak to you like Ben Stein, like the Clear Eyes commercial, or all of a sudden they may start laughing hysterically at a very wildly inappropriate moment, like when somebody's passed away or something like that. A related disorder to schizophrenia is called delusion disorder. It's where somebody has some of those paranoid, delusional beliefs, but they may not show the other symptoms of schizophrenia, like hallucinations or changes in their affect and mood, or sort of the odd behaviors and ways of thinking that are associated with schizophrenia. So it's not really, this isn't the best way to think of it, but it's kind of like schizophrenia light. It's the delusions are there, but everything else is kind of is not present. So schizophrenia, from a psychological standpoint, this really isn't. I don't really like this explanation so much. For example, this type of behavior is reinforced more so than normal behavior. I don't really buy that so much. Sociocultural view, I think a lot of it has to do with it. Poverty, we see higher rates of schizophrenia and poverty and stress and communities that don't have the resources. So I think there is some sociocultural factors at play here as well. But this disorder is primarily a biological brain disorder. We actually see the structure of the brain looks different for people with schizophrenia and people who do not. We see different areas of the brain lighting up for people with schizophrenia and people who do not. We see a strong connection to heredity. The general population has about 1% chance of developing schizophrenia, but if you have, for example, a relative, an identical twin, for example, who has schizophrenia, you have more than a 50% chance of developing it yourself. I want to say if you have a parent with schizophrenia, the rate goes up to 1 in 10 times more likely. So, there are a number of factors that could be at play during pregnancy, for example, things that could be at play, but we know specifically it is a biological disorder. In fact, it's a disease that we've pointed out. So here's the difference in gray matter. Much different. You see a huge loss of gray matter here on the right for people with schizophrenia versus those who are normal adolescents. So it is a disease that affects the brain, affects the thoughts directly. And so here's what I mean by, if you're an identical twin and your identical twin has schizophrenia, you have a 50% chance of developing yourself. Parents and siblings, about 6 to 10%, much higher than the general population. So from the biopsychosocial perspective, there are genetic predispositions that will make certain people more vulnerable. And then because of those vulnerabilities, if you live in a stressful environment, you may see that become expressed more so than if you didn't live in a stressful environment. So it's a number of things. Psychological, social, biological factors. Schizophrenia is primarily a biological disorder, but these other factors will amplify those, that vulnerability if you're in the wrong environment, for example. Okay, Joel believes he has superhuman powers. He is likely suffering from A, hallucinations, B, delusions, C, negative symptoms, or D, referential thinking. Pause the video. What do you think? All right, welcome back. The correct answer is B. It is delusions. He believes, he thinks. That's a key indicator there, is a delusion. Now, if we were to say Joel imagines and sees himself having superpowers and sees the X-ray vision coming out of his eyes or whatever, maybe this would be a hallucination in that case, but the belief is the key part there. Okay, truth or fiction. People with schizophrenia may see or hear things that are not really there. What do you think? Pause the video. Come back when you feel like you have the answer. Welcome back. It is true. It is in fact true. The most common type of hallucination is in fact seeing things or hearing things that are not there. Seeing things is second. The last classification we're going to look at are personality disorders. These are, this is a very broad classification of disorders that is related to when our personality is maladaptive or inflexible, basically meaning when the way we think, behave, and react to other situations or people is maladaptive, when it's dysfunctional. It impairs our ability to live a normal life or causes us tremendous amounts of distress. There are a few different, we're only going to cover a few of these personality disorders, but there are a broad range of them. There's paranoid personality disorder, where people are extra paranoid. They interpret normal behaviors as being somehow threatening to them or demeaning to them. Schizoid personality, this is where somebody displays some of the symptoms of schizophrenia, but more so kind of just the emotional responses. They're flat. They just seemingly don't care about social relationships. Schizotypal personality disorder, this is a very sort of blanket term used to describe people who kind of think differently, kind of somebody we would describe as odd or strange or weird or peculiar in the way they think, behave, or act. Of course, it goes more than that. I'm sure we all know a weird person, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be diagnosed with a disorder. It's like the weird guy, like the weirdest guy, maybe. Another one that's really common that people hear about is antisocial personality disorder. This is also known as being a sociopath or psychopath in some cases, where people have really just no concern for other people. They're more only concerned about themselves. They're very manipulative. They're very charming. They tend to be male rather than female. That's not to say that women can't have this disorder, but you see it far more diagnosed in men. Another personality disorder that's, maybe you've heard about in movies or TV shows or elsewhere is called borderline personality disorder, where you have sort of an instability in relationships, mood, self-image, just across the board. This instability impacts sort of your entire life functioning. A lot of impulse control issues. Avoidant personality disorder, sort of avoiding relationships out of fear, out of rejection. So this is kind of tying a little bit into anxiety disorders there too. Where do they come from? Where do these personality disorders come from? Like all disorders we've talked about so far, there is a genetic component. We may, in fact, we talked about in the previous chapter, we inherit like the big 5 traits. Well, maybe we also inherit some of these other personality traits. It's also linked to, for example, antisocial personality is linked to less gray matter in the prefrontal cortex. That's the part of the brain that regulates impulse control. And people who have antisocial personalities tend to have a tough time dealing with impulse control. They kind of they act out their impulses more so maybe than other people. Psychological factors may be at play as well, cognitive factors, a whole lot of other factors here. Sociocultural factors, the home environment you grow up in, how stable is it or how unstable is it matters a whole lot. So anyways, a lot of things at play. It's a biopsychosocial phenomenon. Okay. Truth or fiction? Some people can kill or maim others without any feelings of guilt. True or false? What do you think? Pause the video. Okay, welcome back. The answer is true. This is the people we're talking about who are antisocial personality. They can hurt or harm or even kill other people without, in extreme cases, can hurt and kill people without having any feelings of guilt. That is one of the defining characteristics of being antisocial. Okay, that is chapter 12. I kind of came at you hard and fast with some of the stuff in chapter 12. It's a nice broad overview. Again, please do not self-diagnose after watching or listening to this video. We are going to come back on the other side of chapter 13 and look at now what do we do to treat the disorders that we've just talked about. So we will continue on with chapter 13. All right, I'll see you on the next one.